Chapter 1 of Some Problems of Philosophy, A Beginning of an Introduction to Philosophy, by William James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Some Problems of Philosophy. He, Charles Renouvier, was one of the greatest of philosophic characters. But for the decisive impression made on me in the '70s by his masterly advocacy of pluralism, I might never have got free from the monistic superstition under which I had grown up. The present volume, in short, might never have been written. This is why, feeling endlessly thankful as I do, I dedicate this textbook to the great Renouvier's memory. Prefatory Note. For several years before his death, Professor William James cherished the purpose of stating his views on certain problems of metaphysics in a book addressed particularly to the readers of philosophy. He began the actual writing of this introductory textbook for students in metaphysics, as he once called it, in March 1909, and to complete it was at last his dearest ambition. But illness and other demands on his diminished strength continued to interfere, and what is now published is all that he had succeeded in writing when he died in August 1910. Two typewritten copies of his unfinished manuscript were found. They had been corrected separately. A comparison of the independent alterations in the two copies showed few and slight differences in phrase and detail, and indicated no formed intention to make substantial changes. Yet the author perhaps expected to make some further alterations in a final revision, if he could finish the book, for in a memorandum dated July 26, 1910, in which he directed the publication of the manuscript, he wrote, "Say it is fragmentary and unrevised." This memorandum continues, "Call it a beginning of an introduction to philosophy. Say that I hoped by it to round out my system, which now was too much like an arch built only on one side." In compliance with the author's request left in the same memorandum, his pupil and friend, Dr. H. M. Kalin, has compared the two versions of the manuscript and largely prepared the book for the press. The divisions and headings in the manuscript were incomplete, and for helpful suggestions as to these grateful acknowledgments are due to Professor R. B. Perry. Henry James, Jr., Cambridge, March 25, 1911. Chapter 1 Philosophy and its Critics. The progress of society is due to the fact that individuals vary from the human average in all sorts of directions, and that the originality is often so attractive or useful that they are recognized by their tribe as leaders, and become objects of envy or admiration, and setters of new ideals. Among the variations, every generation of men produces some individuals exceptionally preoccupied with theory. Such men find matter for puzzle and astonishment where no one else does. Their imagination invents explanations and combines them. They store up the learning of their time, utter prophecies and warnings, and are regarded as sages. Philosophy, etymologically meaning the love of wisdom, is the work of this class of minds, regarded with an indulgent relish, if not with admiration, even by those who do not understand them or believe much in the truth which they proclaim. Philosophy, thus become a race heritage, forms in its totality a monstrously unwieldy mass of learning. So taken, there is no reason why any special science like chemistry or astronomy should be excluded from it. By common consent, however, special sciences are today excluded, for reasons presently to be explained, and what remains is manageable enough to be taught under the name of philosophy by one man if his interest be broad enough. If this were a German textbook, I should first give my abstract definition of the topic, thus limited by usage, then proceed to display its Begriff und Einteilung, and its Aufgabe und Methode. But as such displays are usually unintelligible to beginners, and unnecessary after reading the book, it will conduce to brevity to omit that chapter altogether, useful though it might possibly be to more advanced readers as a summary of what is to follow. I will tarry a moment, however, over the matter of definition. Limited by the omission of the special sciences, the name of philosophy has come more and more to denote ideas of universal scope exclusively. The principles of explanation that underlie all things without exception, the elements common to gods and men and animals and stones, the first whence and the last whither of the whole cosmic procession, the conditions of all knowledge, and the most general rules of human action, these furnish the problems commonly deemed philosophic par excellence, and the philosopher is the man who finds the most to say about them. Philosophy is defined in the usual scholastic textbooks as the knowledge of things in general by their ultimate causes, so far as natural reason can attain to such knowledge. This means that explanation of the universe at large, not description of its details, is what philosophy must aim at. And so it happens that a view of anything is termed philosophic just in proportion as it is broad and connected with other views, and as it uses principles not proximate or intermediate, but ultimate and all embracing, to justify itself. Any very sweeping view of the world is a philosophy in this sense, even though it may be a vague one. It is a Weltanschauung, an intellectualized attitude towards life. Professor Dewey well describes the constitution of all the philosophies that actually exist, when he says that philosophy expresses a certain attitude, purpose, and temper of conjoined intellect and will, rather than a discipline whose boundaries can be neatly marked off. To know the chief rival attitudes towards life, as the history of human thinking has developed them, and to have heard some of the reasons they can give for themselves, ought to be considered an essential part of liberal education. Philosophy, indeed, in one sense of the term, is only a compendous name for the spirit in education which the word college stands for in America. Things can be taught in dry dogmatic ways, or in a philosophic way. At a technical school a man may grow into a first-rate instrument for doing a certain job, but he may miss all the graciousness of mind suggested by the term liberal culture. He may remain a cad, and not a gentleman, intellectually pinned down to his one narrow subject, literal, unable to suppose anything different from what he has seen, without imagination, atmosphere, or mental perspective. Philosophy, beginning in wonder, as Plato and Aristotle said, is able to fancy everything different from what it is. It sees the familiar as if it were strange, and the strange as if it were familiar. It can take things up and lay them down again. Its mind is full of air that plays round every subject. It rouses us from our native dogmatic slumber and breaks up our caked prejudices. Historically, it has always been a sort of fecundation of four different human interests: science, poetry, religion, and logic, by one another. It has sought by hard reasoning for results emotionally valuable. To have some contact with it, to catch its influence, is thus good for both literary and scientific students. By its poetry it appeals to literary minds. By its logic stiffens them up and remedies their softness. By its logic it appeals to the scientific, but softens them by its other aspects, and saves them from too dry a technicality. Both types of student ought to get from philosophy a livelier spirit, more air, more mental background. Hast any philosophy in thee, shepherd? This question of touchstones is the one with which men should always meet one another. A man with no philosophy in him is the most inauspicious and unprofitable of all possible social mates. I say nothing in all this of what may be called gymnastic use of philosophic study, the purely intellectual power gained by defining the high and abstract concepts of the philosopher and discriminating between them. In spite of the advantages thus enumerated, the study of philosophy has systematic enemies, and they were never as numerous as at the present day. The definite conquests of science and the apparent indefiniteness of philosophy's results partly account for this, to say nothing of man's native rudeness of mind, which maliciously enjoys deriding long words and abstractions. Scholastic jargon, medieval dialectics, are for many people synonymous of the word philosophy. With its obscure and uncertain speculations as to the intimate nature and causes of things, the philosopher is likened to a blind man in a dark room looking for a black hat that is not there. His occupation is described as the art of endlessly disputing without coming to any conclusion, or more contemptuously still, as the systematische Missbrauch einer eben zu diesem Zwecken infundenen Terminologie. Only to a very limited degree is this sort of hostility reasonable. I will take up some of the current objections in successive order, since to reply to them will be a convenient way of entering into the interior of our subject. Objection 1. Whereas the sciences make steady progress and yield applications of matchless utility, philosophy makes no progress and has no practical applications. Reply. The opposition is unjustly founded. For the sciences are themselves branches of the tree of philosophy. As fast as questions got accurately answered, the answers were called scientific, and what men call philosophy today is but the residuum of questions still unanswered. At this very moment we are seeing two sciences, psychology and general biology, drop off from the parent trunk and take independent root as specialties. The more general philosophy cannot as a rule follow the voluminous details of any special science. A backward glance at the evolution of philosophy will reward us here. The earliest philosophers in every land were encyclopedic sages, lovers of wisdom, sometimes with and sometimes without a dominantly ethical or religious interest. They were just men curious beyond immediate practical needs, and no particular problems, but rather the problematic generally, was their specialty. China, Persia, Egypt, India had such wise men, but those of Greece are the only sages who until very recently have influenced the course of Western thinking. The earlier Greek philosophy lasted, roughly speaking, for about 2050 years, say from 600 BC onwards. Such men as Thales, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Democritus were mathematicians, theologians, politicians, astronomers, and physicists. All the learning of their time, such as it was at their disposal. Plato and Aristotle continued their tradition, and the great medieval philosophers only enlarged its field of application. If we turn to St. Thomas Aquinas' great Summa, written in the 13th century, we find opinions expressed about literally everything, from God down to matter, with angels, men, and demons taken in on the way. The relations of almost everything with everything else, of the creator with his creatures, of the knower with the known, of substances with forms, of mind with body, of sin with salvation, come successively up for treatment. A theology, a psychology, a system of duties and morals, are given in fullest detail, while physics and logic are established in their universal principles. The impression made on the reader is of almost superhuman intellectual resources. It is true that St. Thomas's method of handling the mass of fact, or supposed fact, which he treated, was different from that to which we are accustomed. He deduced and proved everything, either from fixed principles of reason or from Holy Scripture. The properties and changes of bodies, for example, were explained by the two principles of matter and form, as Aristotle had taught. Matter was the quantitative, determinable, passive element; form the qualitative, unifying, determining, and active principle. All activity was for an end. Things could act on each other only when in contact. The number of species of things was determinate, and their differences discrete, etc., etc. By the beginning of the 17th century men were tired of the elaborate a priori methods of scholasticism. Suarez's treatises availed not to keep them in fashion, but the new philosophy of Descartes, which displaced the scholastic teaching, sweeping over Europe like wildfire, preserved the same encyclopedic character. We think of Descartes nowadays as the metaphysician who said cogito ergo sum, separated mind from matter as two contrasted substances, and gave a renovated proof of God's existence. But his contemporaries thought of him much more as we think of Herbert Spencer in our day, as a great cosmic evolutionist who explained by the redistribution of matter and motion, and the laws of impact, the rotation of the heavens, the circulation of the blood, the refraction of light, apparatus of vision and of nervous action, the passings of the soul, and the connection of the mind and body. Descartes died in 1650. With Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, philosophy for the first time turned more exclusively to the problem of knowledge and became critical. The subjective tendency developed. And although the school of Leibniz, who was the pattern of a universal sage, still kept up the more universal tradition, Leibniz's follower Wolff published systematic treatises on everything, physical as well as moral. Hume, who succeeded Locke, woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber, and since Kant's time the word philosophy has come to stand for mental and moral speculations far more than for physical theories. Until a comparatively recent time, philosophy was taught in our colleges under the name of mental and moral philosophy, or philosophy of the human mind, exclusively, to distinguish it from natural philosophy. But older tradition is the better as well as the completer one. To know the actual peculiarities of the world we are born into is surely as important as to know what makes worlds anyhow abstractly possible. Yet this latter knowledge has been treated by many since Kant's time as the only knowledge worthy of being called philosophical. Common men feel the question, what is nature like, to be as meritorious as the Kantian question, how is nature possible? So philosophy, in order not to lose human respect, must take some notice of the actual constitution of reality. There are signs today of a return to the more objective tradition. Philosophy in the full sense is only man thinking, thinking about generalities rather than about particulars. But whether about generalities or particulars, man thinks always by the same methods. He observes, discriminates, generalizes, classifies, looks for causes, traces analogies, and makes hypotheses. Philosophy, taken as something distinct from science or from practical affairs, follows no method peculiar to itself. All our thinking today is evolved gradually out of primitive human thought, and the only really important changes that have come over its manner, as distinguished from the matters in which it believes, are a greater hesitancy in asserting its convictions, and the habit of seeking verification for them whenever it can. It will be instructive to trace very briefly the origin of our present habits of thought. Auguste Comte, the founder of a philosophy which he called positive, said that human theory on any subject always took three forms in succession. In the theological stage of theorizing, phenomena are explained by spirits producing them. In the metaphysical stage, their essential feature is made into an abstract idea, and this is placed behind them as if it were an explanation. In the positive stage, phenomena are simply described as to their coexistences and successions. Their laws are formulated, but no explanation of their natures or existence is sought after. Thus a spiritus rector would be a metaphysical, a principle of attraction, a theological, and a law of the squares would be a positive theory of the planetary movements. Comte's account is too sharp and definite. Anthropology shows that the earliest attempts at human theorizing mixed the theological and metaphysical together. Common things needed no special explanation. Remarkable things alone, odd things, especially deaths, calamities, diseases, called for it. What made things act was the mysterious energy in them, and the more awful they were, the more of this mana they possessed. The great thing was to acquire mana oneself. Sympathetic magic is the collective name for what seems to have been the primitive philosophy here. You could act on anything by controlling anything else that either was associated with it or resembled it. If you wish to injure an enemy, you should either make an image of him, or get some of his hair or other belongings, or get his name written. Injuring the substitute, you thus made him suffer correspondingly. If you wished the rain to come, you sprinkled the ground; if the wind, you whistled, etc. If you would have yams grow in your garden, put a stone there that looks like a yam. Would you cure jaundice? Give turmeric, that makes things look yellow; or give poppies for troubles of the head, because their seed vessels form a head. This doctrine of signatures played a great part in early medicine. The various mancies and mantics come in here, in which witchcraft and incipient science are indistinguishably mixed. Sympathetic theorizing persists to this present day. Thoughts are things, for a contemporary school, and on the whole a good school, of practical philosophy. Cultivate the thought of what you desire, affirm it, and it will bring all similar thoughts from elsewhere to reinforce it, so that finally your wish will be fulfilled. Little by little more positive ways of considering things began to prevail. Common elements and phenomena began to be singled out and to form the basis of generalizations. But these elements at first had necessarily to be the more dramatic or humanly interesting ones. The hot, the cold, the wet, the dry in things explained their behavior. Some bodies were naturally warm, others cold. Motions were natural or violent. The heavens moved in circles because circular motion was the most perfect. The lever was explained by the greater quantity of perfection embodied in the movement of its longer arm. The sun went south in winter to escape the cold. Precious or beautiful things had exceptional properties. Peacock's flesh resisted putrefaction. The lodestone would drop the iron which it held if the superiorly powerful diamond was brought near, etc. Such ideas sound to us grotesque, but imagine no tracks made for us by scientific ancestors, and what aspects would we single out from nature to understand things by? Not till the beginning of the 17th century did the more insipid kinds of regularity in things abstract men's attention away from the properties originally picked out. Few of us realize how short the career of what we know as science has been. 350 years ago hardly anyone believed in the Copernican planetary theory. Optical combinations were not discovered. The circulation of the blood, the weight of air, the conduction of heat, the laws of motion were unknown. The common pump was inexplicable. There were no clocks, no thermometers, no general gravitation. The world was 5,000 years old. Spirits moved the planets. Alchemy, magic, astrology imposed on everyone's belief. Modern science began only after 1600, with Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Torricelli, Pascal, Harvey, Newton, Huygens, and Boyle. 5 men, telling one another in succession the discoveries which their lives had witnessed, could deliver the whole of it into our hands. Harvey might have told Newton, who might have told Voltaire. Voltaire might have told Dalton, who might have told Huxley, who might have told the readers of this book. The men who began this work of emancipation were philosophers in the original sense of the word, universal sages. Galileo said that he had spent more years on philosophy than months on mathematics. Descartes was a universal philosopher in the fullest sense of the term, but the fertility of the newer conceptions made special departments of truth grow at such a rate that they became too unwieldy with details for the more universal minds to carry them. So the special sciences of mechanics, astronomy, and physics began to drop off from the parent stem. No one could have foreseen in advance the extraordinary fertility of the more insipid mathematical aspects which these geniuses ferreted out. No one could have dreamed of the control over nature which the search for their concomitant variations would give. Laws describe these variations, and all our present laws of nature have as their model the proportionality of v to t and of s to t squared, which Galileo first laid bare. Pascal's discovery of the proportionality of altitude to barometric height, Newton's of acceleration of distance, Boyle's of air volume to pressure, Descartes' of sine to cosine in the refracted ray, were the first fruits of Galileo's discovery. There was no question of agencies, nothing animistic or sympathetic in this new way of taking nature. It was description only, of concomitant variations, after the particular quantities that varied had been successfully abstracted out. The result soon showed itself in a differentiation of human knowledge into two spheres, one called science, within which the more definite laws apply, the other general philosophy, in which they do not. The state of mind called positivistic is the result. Down with philosophy is the cry of innumerable scientific minds. Give us measurable facts only, phenomena without the mind's additions, without entities or principles that pretend to explain. It is largely from this kind of mind that the objection that philosophy has made no progress proceeds. It is obvious enough that if every step forward which philosophy makes, every question to which an accurate answer is found, gets accredited to science, the residuum of unanswered problems will alone remain to constitute the domain of philosophy, and will alone bear her name. In point of fact, this is just what is happening. Philosophy has become a collective name for questions that have not yet been answered to the satisfaction of all by whom they have been asked. It does not follow, because some of these questions have waited 2000 years for an answer, that no answer will ever be forthcoming. 2000 years probably measure but one paragraph in the great romance of adventure called the history of the intellect of man. The extraordinary progress of the last 300 years is due to a rather sudden finding of the way in which a certain order of questions ought to be attacked, questions admitting of mathematical treatment. But to assume therefore that the only possible philosophy must be mechanical and mathematical, and to disparage all inquiry into the other sorts of questions, is to forget the extreme diversity of aspects under which reality undoubtedly exists. To the spiritual questions the proper avenues of philosophic approach will also undoubtedly be found. They have to some extent been found already. In some respects, indeed, science has made less progress than philosophy. Its most general conceptions would astonish neither Aristotle nor Descartes, could they revisit our earth. The composition of things from elements, their evolution, the conservation of energy, the idea of a universal determinism, would seem to them commonplace enough. The little things, the microscopes, electric lights, telephones, and details of the sciences, would be to them the awe-inspiring things. But if they opened our books on metaphysics, or visited a philosophic lecture room, everything would sound strange. The whole idealistic or critical attitude of our time would be novel, and it would be long before they took it in. Objection 2. Philosophy is dogmatic, and pretends to settle things by pure reason, whereas the only fruitful mode of getting at truth is to appeal to concrete experience. Science collects, classes, and analyzes facts, and thereby far outstrips philosophy. Reply. This objection is historically valid. Too many philosophers have aimed at closed systems, established a priori, claiming infallibility, and to be accepted or rejected only as totals. The sciences, on the other hand, using hypotheses only, but always seeking to verify them by experiment and observation, open a way for indefinite self-correction and increase. At the present day, it is getting more and more difficult for dogmatists claiming finality for their systems to get a hearing in educated circles. Hypothesis and verification, the watchwords of science, have set the fashion too strongly in academic minds. Since philosophers are only men thinking about things in the most comprehensive possible way, they can use any method whatsoever freely. Philosophy must, in any case, complete the sciences, and must incorporate their methods. One cannot see why, if such a policy should appear advisable, philosophy might not end by forswearing all dogmatism whatever, and become as hypothetical in her manners as the most empirical science of them all. Objection 3. Philosophy is out of touch with real life, for which it substitutes abstractions. The real world is various, tangled, painful. Philosophers have, almost without exception, treated it as noble, simple, perfect, ignoring the complexity of fact and indulging in a sort of optimism that exposes their systems to the contempt of common men, and to the satire of such writers as Voltaire and Schopenhauer. The great popular success of Schopenhauer is due to the fact that, first among philosophers, he spoke the concrete truth about the ills of life. Reply. This objection also is historically valid, but no reason appears why philosophy should keep aloof from reality permanently. Her manners may change as she successfully develops. The thin and noble abstractions may give way to more solid and real constructions, when the materials and methods for making such constructions shall be more and more securely ascertained. In the end, philosophers may get into as close contact as realistic novelists with the facts of life. In conclusion, in its original acceptation, meaning the completest knowledge of the universe, philosophy must include the results of all the sciences, and cannot be contrasted with the latter. It simply aims at making of science what Herbert Spencer calls a system of completely unified knowledge. In the more modern sense of something contrasted with the sciences, philosophy means metaphysics. The older sense is the more worthy sense, and as the results of the sciences get more available for coordination, and the conditions for finding truth in different kinds of questions get more methodically defined, we may hope that the term will revert to its original meaning. Science, metaphysics, and religion may then again form a single body of wisdom, and lend each other mutual support. At present this hope is far from its fulfillment. I propose in this book to take philosophy in the narrow sense of metaphysics, and to let both religion and the results of the sciences alone. End of chapter 1.